Hi, this is Ann Holmes with No Sewing into Quilted. Today we're going to be showing you how we join the units on Springtime in the Mountains. So we have 5 units, the center section, 2 short sides, and 2 long sides. So the first thing we're going to do is determine where to trim up our center section. We're going to end up with 4 seams in this quilt. We're going to sew the 2 short sides together, and then we'll do the 2 long sides. And so to determine where we're going to trim our pattern up, this is our 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance in these pieces to join the units. All right, so we placed our ruler carefully on this line in our design, and then this is our 1/2 inch seam allowance right there. So we put a piece of blue tape here and marked that it's in that direction. And now when we go to trim our pieces, we will be turning this around and using our rotary cutter to cut right along that seam allowance edge. Essentially what we're trimming off is the extra seam allowance we added with our magic button. But anyway, we just want to do this to make sure that we have a straight line. I'm going to do the first cut here directly across from our line. And then I can scoot this back and just make sure that it's lined up to trim that off. I'm going to throw those edges away. So now what I'm going to do is just pull this down and keep trimming around from one direction. Right, now we've trimmed up the center unit, and we're going to now work on the 2 short sides first.
Okay, so for the short sides, we're going to just use a longer ruler and do the same thing that we did to the shorter ruler for the center. It just gives us, rather than having to do the same ruler twice, we can just do it with basically one cut. So exact same process, lined up. Here's our finished edge. We've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That'll be where we sew the units together. And we're going up to this 4 inch line, which is where I'm going to put down painter's tape. Okay, so we're using this longer ruler because the pattern changes here. So whereas we don't have the just a solid line, so by having the tape here, we can continue this straight edge from this piece all the way up through these diagonals. So same process as the center, lining up the blue painter's tape with the edge of this first piece.
All right, so now we still have to trim the top edge of this side unit. So what we're going to do, we want to keep our 1/2 inch seam allowance again. We're going to fold the paper back on that 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, we just used some blue tape to fold that back. We have the seam allowance exposed here. That's what we need to join our units together. Right, so we also folded these sides back with the 1/2 inch allowance showing. So now to find this location, we have a few design points here that we can put our pins in. So this already has a 1/2 inch there. So let's see where that pin comes out. Punch that through there. Let's put it up here. And make sure that that's on that line. We'll put the pin through there and line that up. Find a point. We'll stick that through. See that lines up pretty good. There are pins poking through there. All right, and now we'll come to the other side. We can mark our center point here. Push that through. And yeah, that's right on the money there. Now we're using the help of a ruler here to give us a nice straight line, and we're just trimming that off. All right, this is trimmed on 3 sides only, the top and the 2 sides. The bottom, this will be the bottom of our quilt. We're not going to trim that yet because after the machine quilting, we will square up the quilt. And these points do not get cut off. That's part of the design. We'll be putting a continuous bias binding on this quilt, which will go around this shape. All right, so now we're going to join one of the short sides to the center unit. Find the center point of the short side. I am just folding this together with the wrong sides together, and I'm going to put a pin in the center here. So that's our center point, and this is our center point. Let's see if we can mark that. I'll take a ruler and just draw a straight line out there. So there we go. And it's like right there. We'll see if we can find that. I guess I could put a pin there too, which is a good idea, and then I can see it easier. So we'll put another pin there. All right, so let's join those 2 pins together now. Right sides together. And then we'll finish pinning this out to the 2 sides. I'll go out to the end and then work to the middle. So we'll line that up. And any slight irregularities, we can ease it in. We're going to be using the walking foot to join these pieces. As we're working here, you can notice the back of our quilt top where the French fuse has sealed down. All the seams are turned edges. It's all interlocked and very flat. It will be good for the long arm machine quilter to be able to quilt over this. She will use an applique foot on her hopping foot to go around all of the pieces first and then do the quilting in the middle. So we're stitching and quilting all at the same time, but she'll go around the edges first, the pieces that are on top first. All right, now we have this pinned together. We're going to take it to the machine. I have a seam allowance. We're going to set our seam allowance at 1/2 inch and then sew this together. All right, so I'm just checking to make sure that I'm going to have a 1/2 inch sewing line when I sew. I'm going to use the outside edge of my foot, and then I move the needle over 2 spaces, and I'm ready to sew a 1/2 inch seam. I'm going to pull this out. It's hard to see with the white thread also, but I think we've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance now, so I can go ahead. I'm confident that I can sew the seam. The only thing is you want to remember, if you turn your machine off, if you stop when you're doing this, you have to reposition your needle because the default is always to go back to the original setting. As I'm sewing this, because the French fuse has all the seam allowances interlocking, I don't have to worry about pressing my or folding my seam allowances a certain way while I'm doing this stitching, which is nice. It's a nice clean back. All right, this is what it looks like with the first short side attached. We're going to do the second short side, and then we'll show you how to prepare it for the long sides. We've now sewn the second short side together. So we're going to take our iron and press the seam allowance. I'm just going to kind of set the seam allowance, and then I'm going to open it. I'm going to open the seam allowance. And press. All right, I've pressed my seam allowance open, and now what I'm going to use is my magic glue stick again, and I just glide it along these seam allowances because I don't want them to accidentally turn over when I'm trying to sew the seam together, and I want everything to be nice and flat for the long arm machine quilter so she has no big bumps to go over. So I'm just gliding this along here. It doesn't have to be slathered with glue, but it makes it nice and tacky. I put an extra swipe on the ends where we're sewing the seam together. So after the glue stick is down, I just go ahead and press it one more time. So everything stays nice and flat. Now we're ready to work on our drawing for the long side. We'll be adding the long side next. Paper is so versatile, and this has been used several times. We built Happy on the Mountains first and then expanded it, added paper to continue our design to make it a wider project. And the short sides of our quilt were exactly the same as the center part of the long sides. So all I did was cut this off on the seam lines and then add a little pink paper for our seam allowances for the short sides. But now we're going to, because we need this again, we're just going to cut this off on the finished edge of the quilt. That's that inside line. And then we'll tape the two ends to our long side pattern. All right, so for preparing our pattern, we turned back this top edge again, and now we're going to join it to the center part of this unit, and we're just using Scotch tape to put this together. So we'll line things up and then use some tape. All right, now that we've taped this together, we're going to go ahead and tape our second end. All right, because there is no straight line through the center where we're going to be joining this to our center unit and the two short sides, we folded the paper back again on the seam allowance, and we're going to pin this to our paper on a few reference points. We can join it here, and you know, along the way, a few places we'll put some long pins in, and then that will give us a nice straight edge for trimming the top edge of this unit.
So we've pinned this at a couple anchor points to keep the pattern in place to help give us a straight line for trimming off the excess after our seam allowance. Remember, this is the finished edge of the quilt, and then this is the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we're cutting off the excess past the seam allowance. And I'm also, as I'm doing this, whenever I can, even though we've done everything we can to make sure we have a straight edge, using the ruler, pinning it back, measuring as we did the design, I'm just also using the design elements and trying to make sure that I'm square. So anywhere I can, line them up as well, vertically and horizontally with the markings on my ruler. It just adds extra confidence that you're not cutting off things you'll need later.
All right, now we're ready to join the long side to the center unit now. And so again, we're going to find the center point, which is right here, and put a pin. And then we know that this is the center of this unit. So we'll put a pin there too. All right, so now we're going to put those pins together and put a couple pins here. This is the same process as we did for the short sides, adding the short sides. But there's one more thing we need to tell you about. All right, so we know where our center point is. Now also, these little triangular shapes meet at the same place off of our center unit. So we're going to line those up, and those seam allowances come together. So see, I'm lining those up and putting a pin in that place. And then we go out to the end and line these edges up. We have a line here too with that water piece that surrounds the quilt. We can line that up too.
Okay, so what's down on the table here is the middle section with the short sides on the end. We've just pinned one of the long sides to all of that, and we've just pinned it at this point. I'm just gonna kind of lay it back and check all of the intersections to make sure that with our seam allowances that everything's lined up. So ideally we won't have to seam rip anything out once we've sewn in our 1/2 inch seam to join these units. So I'm just checking here, so where the center is meeting the triangle portion of the long side, and then just checking again at the edge, so our kind of watery border all lines up. And we realized that as we were prepping the long side to join to the unit, to the center unit, and the short sides, is that we trimmed the outside edge of it. We didn't need to do that because it's the outside. That's what we would have saved for squaring it up, for squaring up the quilt after it's already machine quilted and sewn all at the same time. So when you're doing your long sides, all you need to do is the paper pattern piece on the top, where it's folded back, and then trimming off the excess past your seam allowance to join it to the center unit. So leave the ends alone.
All right, this is 4 of 5 units sewn together with our 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I moved this to our big table. I was struggling on an ironing board. Just move it to a big flat table, your dining table or whatever. I'm lucky I have this big work table, which I love. But anyway, so you can see this. We just have the last side, the last long side to add now. I should mention that when you're pressing this open, you shouldn't freak out, because remember, there's no sewing in our quilt yet except for this seam line. And when we're pressing this open, you get your iron caught on these little tails. But anyway, you can just press everything flat. All right, so this is the back side of our quilt top. It has Springtime in the Mountains. It was made in 5 units. This is the center unit. Then we added the 2 short sides on either side. And now this is a long side that we added. So there are 4 seams in this that joins the entire quilt top. We press the seam allowances open so there won't be any bumps for the person that's going to long arm machine quilt this for us. After I put this all together and laid it on the floor and studied it for a while, I realized that I had to edit some pieces. You saw me replace this piece in here with a yellow flowery thing, and I didn't like it after all, so then I put it back with this more teal color because I think it was calmer and it brought the colors from the center of the quilt into the bottom. Everything is so busy. I love the flowers, and you could almost call this quilt The Earth Laughs in Flowers. I love that quote. But anyway, this is Springtime in the Mountains, so thank you very much for watching.